Humans have always been fascinated by horror stories, dating back to ancient Greece and Rome when gladiators would gather their friends around, tell stories about demons, evil spirits in the afterlife, and then go kill each other. We just love the feeling of suspense that fills your body as you prepare for a scare or a huge reveal. Whether it be books, movies, smoke signals, media has always struggled to immerse the audience into the world that it's created. After all, you can only fit so much into a 2-hour runtime or 500 pages of a book. It's much more horrifying when you're not just witnessing the events unfold, but actually have the agency to decide whether the protagonist lives or dies. He just like me for real for real. There is no form of media that's been as effective at scaring the viewer as video games, and there probably never will be, unless the microchips thing works out. It's just such a natural fit. Video games just plop the player right into the middle of their world, and allow them to explore and experience it at their own pace. And instead of only feeling on edge during the build up to a big scene, it's almost near constant suspense as you never know when an enemy is gonna jump out at you. In this video, I'm gonna provide a brief history of horror games and see how they've evolved. And I don't just mean graphics wise. Over time, horror games have introduced new mechanics, elements, and tropes. That's what I want to explore. Trends and innovations that have influenced horror games to make them what they are today. But I've been dragging out this intro way too long, so let's just get into the first ever horror game. 3D Monster Maze released in the year 1981. Now, while many games around the time featured horror elements, 3D Monster Maze was the first true horror game. The game puts you in a randomly generated maze with only one exit. While trying to escape, you're being pursued by a hungry T-Rex. The T-Rex becomes more active the closer it gets to the player, and once it spots you, it begins to chase you. In addition to being the first horror game, this is also one of the first ever 3D games created. And at the time, this was truly revolutionary. The reception for 3D Monster Maze was overwhelmingly positive, with many at the time calling it the best game that they had ever played. Even critics praised the game, calling it innovative and well presented. And keep in mind, this is when video games weren't as popular and they were kind of seen as a children's toy at this time, so this is pretty impressive. And even though the game was made 41 years ago and isn't as advanced as what we have now, I think it's still pretty effective. The game doesn't have sound, but it does have subtitles underneath the screen to warn you when you're getting close to the monster. Now, it may not seem very scary at first, but when you're wandering around the maze and all of a sudden you see the Rex's Seen You subtitle pop up right underneath your screen, you kind of start to panic a little bit. And nowadays, this might not seem like the creepiest thing you've ever seen, but just imagine for 1 second that you go back to 1981. You're wandering through the maze and you're feeling that feeling of suspense while you try not to get caught. And all of a sudden, this peeks around the corner. It's pretty damn scary. I could only imagine what it felt like playing this game when it first came out. Nowadays, it kind of just reminds me of the T-Rex Chrome game where you jump over the cactuses. But overall, I think this is a pretty strong first entry into the horror genre. And it really raised the bar for its time and showed what could be done for video games in the future. And then 1 year later, someone said, let me just ruin all that. In the year 1982, E.T. the Extraterrestrial released, and this game was so bad that people all over the political spectrum were able to come together, put aside their differences, and burn this game. What effect does E.T. the Extraterrestrial have on the horror genre? Well, E.T. was so bad that it's widely considered one of the main reasons for the video game crash of 1983. The gameplay was literally roam around until you fall in a hole and then find a way to get out. Like, imagine being the kid who got this game for Christmas. They probably never went anywhere near a video game ever again. Home video game revenues peaked at about $3.2 billion in the year 1983, and then 2 years later, in the year 1985, they had dropped to about $100 million, a drop of almost 97%, according to Wikipedia. This would last for about 3 years, but it would take horror games a little longer to recover. And this time you just kind of get a lot of bad and poopy games, but horror games would eventually bounce back in the year 1989 when Capcom released Sweet Home. Sweet Home follows a group of 5 filmmakers as they explore an old haunted mansion. Along the way, they encounter ghosts and monsters. Sweet Home is considered by many to be a landmark in gaming, and is cited for laying the groundwork for the survival horror genre. The game is also very influential, being responsible for mechanics that we see in games today like QuickTime events and inventory management. Sweet Home is focused on exploration, storytelling, and horror elements. The game also had 5 separate endings, which is pretty impressive at the time. Sweet Home was extremely popular in Japan when it released, but it never received an official English translation. Many believe that this was due to the game's excessive gore and gruesome imagery, but a fan-made English translation would eventually be made in the year 2000. Sweet Home is based on a film of the same name. The two were actually advertised alongside each other. Instead of copy-pasting the movie's story, the game actually diverts and expands upon the film's script. At the time, this was fairly uncommon for video games, it was one of the many things that helped to make Sweet Home so unique. Truly iconic. Now, I just want to say that in this video, I'm going to be talking about landmarks, games, or trends that influence the horror genre as a whole. But with that being said, let's move on. Now at this point, gaming had entered what is known as the composite era. Developers began to use mechanics from one genre to solve challenges in another. This led to more higher quality and polished games. Games like Mario 64, Sonic, Doom, and Street Fighter all released around this time. This is when the horror genre in video games really started to blossom. And now with fully 3D environments, the horror genre was really able to shine and show off its true potential. With games like Alone in the Dark captivating horror fans with its eerie and mysterious atmosphere, creating one of the first fully immersive worlds in gaming. And of course, Resident Evil. Now, Resident Evil is a game that needs no introduction, but I'ma do one anyway. Released in 1996, Resident Evil is one of the most recognizable and iconic video game franchises of all time. Over time, the franchise would go on to expand into other forms of media, including books, comics, and film.
Beautiful 180, crazy.
Just gonna avoid that. Today, Resident Evil is the highest grossing horror franchise of all time. Originally, Resident Evil was supposed to be a remake of Sweet Home, but it got so big that they had to make it its own thing. Capcom originally released Resident Evil in Japan under the name Biohazard, but it was changed for Western audiences because of copyright. Apparently, there was another game called Biohazard and a shitty band or something. Sweet Home set the groundwork for the survival horror genre. Then Resident Evil took that blueprint and created a 5-star hotel on top of it. The player controls one of two characters as they try to escape a zombie-infested mansion. What made Resident Evil so special was the introduction of resource management. Not only did this allow Resident Evil to stand out, but it was also the main source of tension in the game. Every bullet counts and could be the difference between life or death. You see, in Resident Evil, you could actually fight back against the enemy, so you weren't forced to just sit in a hole and find a way to get out. In addition to keeping track of what's in your inventory, you also have to solve puzzles in order to escape the mansion. It forces you to think strategically in tough situations, and really makes you feel that constant pressure. But despite this, the game still feels fair. The level design is perfect, and you never know when a monster is going to jump around the corner. But in order to balance the encounters, the game gives you sound cues to tell you when enemies are nearby. And for the time, the game's graphics were amazing. This was truly unbelievable, as the main characters actually somewhat resembled a human instead of looking like a problem on a math test. And despite some small issues, Resident Evil's gameplay was amazing. The only major flaw with the game was the voice acting, as it kind of sounded like a church play.
What is this? What is it? What is this?
What is it?
What is it? What is it? You were almost a Jill sandwich.
What does that mean?
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
But besides that, it was pretty good. But then in 2002, the remake came out and turned it up to Wumbo, basically fixing all the issues with the game. One of the most controversial aspects of Resident Evil is the controls. Many believe that they suck and just kind of make the game harder to play. But the controls were made to fit with the third-person camera angle, so this really isn't a flaw. No matter how you feel about Resident Evil, you can't deny its success and influence. Not only did it help to bring zombies back into the mainstream, but it also helped to really legitimize survival horror as a genre. Resident Evil is survival horror at its best, and who knows where the genre would be without it. And the soundtrack is heat as well. The standard of quality for video games had really risen with games like Resident Evil, Mario, and Sonic. And while there were a couple of low-quality games that would try to bank off of Resident Evil's success, eventually in 1999 we would get Silent Hill. Now today, Silent Hill is known as one of the two juggernauts of the horror game industry, but in 1999 it was just a no-name game created by developers who had failed at other projects. Team Silent was a development team within Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo. According to composer Akira Yamaoka, Team Silent consisted of developers who had failed other projects. They would go on to develop Silent Hill, which would become a massive success. What made Silent Hill so special is that it moved away from B-movie horror elements and chose to focus on a more psychological horror style, putting a huge emphasis on the game's atmosphere. In Silent Hill, you play as Harry Mason as he navigates through a monster-filled town in order to find his daughter Cheryl. The gameplay mainly consists of combat, exploration, and puzzle solving. Just like Resident Evil, the puzzle solving is meant to be challenging yet fair. But unlike Resident Evil, the controls are made much more challenging on purpose. The game utilizes utilizes a third-person camera view, occasionally switching to other angles for dramatic effect, but this only occurs in pre-scripted areas. Around this time, it was uncommon to have more than one camera angle in a game. But the real highlight of Silent Hill was its ambiance. The game didn't have the impressive graphics of Resident Evil, but it was able to utilize tools like fog in order to mitigate the limitations of the console, in order to keep the player immersed in the game. This feature would later be used by many games in the future, and for the majority of the game, the only light source is just a little flashlight. This shit's scurry. Silent Hill just felt so much more intimate and relatable compared to other games released around the time. Team Silent could have decided to just make another Resident Evil ripoff, but instead they decided to make something that would really stand out. No one expected anything from them, but despite that, Team Silent would go on to create something absolutely beautiful. Something that will be remembered fondly for years and years to come. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, a fair amount of horror games were based off of movies. This is where we got games like Friday the 13th, Halloween, and E.T. But after the success of games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, we would begin to see a rise in video game movies. In the late 90s, early 2000s, horror games exploded. In 1998, Resident Evil 2 came out, refining the blueprint of the first game, adding unique storylines, and of course, one of the most thirsted after characters in gaming history. Right next to Chica. And it must have worked because Resident Evil became the fastest selling video game in North America, selling over 3 million copies within the first month. Around this time in 1998, Metal Gear Solid released. This game included the famous scene of Psycho Mantis reading the player's memory card. Imagine you're like 13 years old and you're playing Metal Gear Solid and all of a sudden Psycho Mantis is—
You enjoy role-playing games.
That is pretty damn scary. Now, the reason why I mention this is because this was a huge moment for not just horror games, but horror in video games. This is one of the first times that a video game was able to break the fourth wall and like reach out of the console and tell you like, oh, I know exactly what you're doing. You're playing Castlevania, aren't you? Now, moving on from that, in 1999, System Shock 2 released, an amalgamation of action, role-playing, and survival horror games. System Shock 2 is highly influential and today considered ahead of its time. But despite critical acclaim and even making some of the greatest game of all time lists, the game failed commercially. I don't see enough people talking about this game, so I just thought I'd mention it. Also, a small shout out to Alice, which came out in the year 2000. It's kind of loose in the genre, but I really like the art style. After the massive success of the first game, Silent Hill released to critical acclaim. The game sold over 1 million copies in the first month. Today, Silent Hill 2 isn't just considered one of the best games in the series, but possibly one of the best games of all time. Silent Hill 2 is aware of the blurry line between nightmare and conscious fear, and it's able to switch between the two on a dime. The game emphasizes deep psychological horror and the study of its own characters. There's so much thought and passion put into the game by the developers, and you can just feel it while playing. This is one of the rare games that really feels alive, and it just makes it all the more frightening. Silent Hill 2 also introduces huge icons of the horror genre, like the Pyramid Head and the nurses. One thing I love about Silent Hill 2 is how the story actually syncs up with the gameplay, with the main characters slowly losing their sanity throughout the game. Usually when you play a game, the game doesn't address the fact that you just killed like 20 people, 400 zombies, almost died like 30 times, and almost had to cut your own arm off. Funnily enough, usually the player ends the game more traumatized than the protagonist. But in Silent Hill 2, the character's sanity is one of the main points of the story. And I mean, it makes sense how someone's mental health would begin to deteriorate after seeing something like this. Like the first game, the ambiance of Silent Hill 2 is absolutely perfect. It does such a good job of depicting how paranoia and anxiety would look in the physical world. The game's art direction is just beautiful. What makes Silent Hill 2 so good is it feels alive. It feels like the game is reaching out and communicating with you. And it's able to accomplish this feeling without getting all mega self-aware, which is really impressive and respectable even 22 years later. This game is an absolute masterpiece.
I'm grateful to be able to play this game.
After the success of Silent Hill 2, the psychological horror genre would rise in popularity. In this time period, one of the most notable titles to release was Eternal Darkness in 2002. Upon release, Eternal Darkness received positive reviews from critics, but didn't do too well commercially. Many attribute this to the game being delayed, as it was originally supposed to be a launch title for the GameCube. But today, Eternal Darkness is remembered positively by fans and critics alike. The game had a very unique story structure, switching from past to present in between missions. The gameplay consisted of battling monsters, solving puzzles, and using magic, apparently. But what made Eternal Darkness extremely unique was the sanity features. Basically, the player is given a bar that's meant to represent their sanity. The bar depletes every time you witness something scary or disturbing. Throughout the game, the player has to monitor the sanity meter or else shit like this happens. And this game doesn't limit the fuckery to just in-game stuff. It also gives the player the illusion that it's messing with their TV volume or deleting their save files. This feature is absolutely genius, and we haven't seen anything like it since. And there's actually a reason for that. Eternal Darkness was developed by Silicon Knights and published by Nintendo. So Nintendo decided to do their thing and patent the sanity feature. And that's why we'll never get a game like Eternal Darkness again. Moving on, in 2003, Fatal Frame released. Today this game usually ranks towards the top of many of the scariest games of all time lists, and was even nominated for Best Adventure Game in 2004. The game prioritized its horror and unsettling atmosphere above all else, bringing traditional Japanese elements and folklore to an American audience. While many horror games were made in Japan around this time, this was one of the first to really embrace the culture. Fatal Frame's gameplay is pretty unique, featuring two modes. In field mode, the player can examine items and search areas for clues. When the camera item is used, the game switches into viewfinder mode. In this mode, you're able to defeat ghosts and spirits who are trying to attack you by taking photos of them. This looks fucking terrifying. The player will spend the majority of the game in field mode, as viewfinder mode is only used for combat encounters. In the year 2004, The Suffering released. In The Suffering, you play as an inmate as they attempt to escape a prison overrun by monsters. The Suffering put a heavy emphasis on the game's combat, giving the player a weapon almost immediately as well as a beast mode form that the player is able to transform into during certain parts of the game. The game was criticized for giving the player too much power and not being very scary. The Suffering also had a morality system that would be affected by choices made in-game, and would determine if you get the good, bad, or neutral ending. One of the strongest, if not the strongest aspect of The Suffering was the monster designs, and I mean, just look at this thing. For a while, the game was seen as underrated, but today it's getting some pretty well-deserved praise. In 2005, we would see the release of Call of Cuthulu, Dark Corners of the Earth. Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's 1936 novel, The Shadow over Innsmouth, Call of Cthulhu puts the player in a first-person camera angle. The game was praised for being realistic and immersive, with many dark and disturbing environments, as well as a very compelling story. But Call of Cthulhu was far from perfect, as it had one major problem. It was extremely janky. The game was extremely glitchy and riddled with bugs. And this is before we expected AAA games to come out like half finished, so the game did not do very well commercially. But these bugs weren't because the developers were lazy. The game was originally supposed to release in 1999. The game was delayed multiple times, went through a bunch of revisions, and had a lot of its most ambitious features cut, including a multiplayer game mode apparently. The game also had sanity features, but not even that could live up to its full potential because of the patent from Nintendo. Instead, the sanity effects consisted of shaking the screen and making loud noises. But despite all the negatives that I've mentioned, the game was still pretty good. And today there's a version out there that's not all buggy and janky and actually somewhat playable.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
When Resident Evil 4 released, the fate of the franchise was uncertain, so Capcom decided to take a gamble, changing the formula, focusing on more dynamic action and an over-the-shoulder camera angle. And it worked, as Resident Evil 4 would sell 11 million copies and receive critical acclaim, scoring an impressive 94 on Metacritic. Resident Evil 4's gameplay was sped up to resemble a blockbuster action movie. Not only did this bring back a lot of old players who were previously tired of the series, but also introduced a whole new generation of players to survival horror. Little Jimmy meets Sadler.
A senior moment, perhaps.
Once again, Resident Evil had brought survival horror back into the mainstream, and would go on to inspire titles like Dead Space and The Last of Us in the future. Hell, Resident Evil 4 even embraced the dialogue, leaning into the goofy, cheesy nature of it.
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. But then again, maybe you did. No thanks, bro.
I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer.
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
I could keep playing these clips forever. In addition to the amazing gameplay, the graphics were also beautiful. Resident Evil 4 would win Game of the Year in 2005, and today is remembered as one of the greatest games of all time.
You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it. I'm wearing hockey pads.
Condemned Criminal Origins also released in the year 2005, developed by Monolith Productions and published by Sega, or according to my notes, Segway. Condemned was first person, but what set it apart from most FPS games at the time was that Condemned prioritized melee combat. The player is able to use pipes and axes as weapons, which they can find hidden throughout the map. And while the game does have guns, they're pretty rare and usually don't have very much ammo in them, unless you're able to steal one off of an enemy. The game's level design is also really good, instilling a feeling of suspense inside of the player as you never know when an enemy could lurk behind a corner. With the capabilities of the Xbox 360, the game developers were able to create an unsettling and realistic environment, using tight corners and small rooms to create tension, with a heavy focus on close quarters combat. Condemned received positive reviews from critics, critics and would become one of the best-selling launch titles for the 360. But Monolith wasn't content with just one great game. The company was on somewhat of a run at this time. Monolith went back-to-back as they released Fear 2 months earlier, another first-person game, but instead of prioritizing melee combat, this one was a little bit more traditional. The goal of Fear was to make the player feel like an action hero with destructible environments and slow-motion cutscenes. But what Fear was really known for was its amazing AI. The game's AI used a new technique to give hostile NPCs an unusually broad range of actions in response to what the player is doing. The enemies can work as a team, performing flanking maneuvers and laying down suppressive fire, and they even attempt to retreat when under heavy fire. The game was criticized for its weak story and poor graphics, but Monolith probably didn't care, because the game would become a commercial success, selling 3 million copies worldwide. Dead Space released in the year 2008, developed by EA Redwood Shores and published by Electronic Arts. In Dead Space, the player controls Isaac Clarke as he navigates through a spaceship, fighting monsters and solving puzzles. Dead Space combined the action of games like Resident Evil 4 with psychological horror elements. Apparently, Dead Space was supposed to be System Shock 3, but after the release of Resident Evil, the game was completely changed, adding an over-the-shoulder camera angle and more action. Dead Space had an amazing atmosphere, taking place on a spaceship, creating a feeling of isolation and despair. The sound design and incredible graphics made the game extremely immersive. Dead Space was nominated for multiple industry awards and was ranked by journalists as one of the greatest video games ever made. One aspect of Dead Space that I really like is the game's UI. The player's health is clearly displayed on the back of Isaac's suit. Not only does this remove clutter from the screen, allowing for the player to take in the game's beauty, usually when you go back and play older games, the health bar designs can look outdated and clunky, and Dead Space avoids that by weaving the health bar into the player character's model. Almost all objectives and information are displayed on Isaac's pop-up HUD. The player is able to track objectives using a hologram instead of a big ugly floating icon. And I really appreciate this, because me personally, this is one of the things that really pulls me out of a game. Dead Space just has a certain flow to it. Most of the game's story is conveyed to the player through the radio, but whenever there is a cutscene, it doesn't take you out of the game because all cutscenes are rendered with in-game assets. Whether it be the music, the enemies, the sound design, or the gameplay, Dead Space just does so much right. Dead Space just feels so timeless, and the game just got a really good remake, so go play that. But I just want to end off this section by saying I recommend this game, and if you're able to, please experience it for yourself. I wasn't doing ratings up until this point, but I give this game a Isaac Clarke out of 10. After the release of Dead Space, many began to see AAA horror games as repetitive or formulaic, and it didn't help that there seemed to be a drop in quality of AAA games around this time, specifically survival horror games. The market felt saturated and unoriginal as everyone wanted to make the next Resident Evil 4, but no one wanted to make the next E.T. the Extraterrestrial. That is the last time I mentioned this game in this video, I'm sorry. Survival horror is moving more towards fast-paced action and neglecting, the horror part. So when Amnesia released in the year 2010, it felt like a breath of fresh air.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is and I can't believe I'm doing this. We're playing some Amnesia: The Dark Descent.
Amnesia was first person, but what made it stand out from titles like Fear or Condemned is in Amnesia, you don't have the ability to fight back. Instead, the game tasks the player with avoiding enemies instead of fighting them head on. Many horror fans loved how the game prioritized scaring the player over all else, and the game spread like wildfire, being dubbed the scariest game of all time, being praised for its dimly lit atmosphere and unsettling sound design, which the game actually won awards for. Amnesia also has a sanity system that triggers during encounters with enemies and disturbing events. Amnesia's sanity effects seem to be inspired by Call of Cthulhu, with low sanity causing visual and auditory hallucinations and an increased chance of attracting monsters, while its complete depletion results in a temporary drop in mobility or death in higher difficulties. 2014 was a good year for horror games, with titles like Alien Isolation, The Evil Within, and of course, PT. PT stands for Playable Teaser. PT was published by Konami and directed by Hideo Kojima in collaboration with Guillermo del Toro. The protagonist was even played by Norman Reedus. The game received praise for its direction, visuals, storytelling, and supernatural horror, and this game really likes to fuck with you. The puzzles had the player interact with the game in strange ways, causing the game to feel alive and self-aware. PT was supposed to be a teaser for a new installment in the Silent Hill series, a game named Silent Hills. But when Hideo Kojima left Konami, the project was cancelled and PT was pulled off the PlayStation Store. And I wish they didn't, because I want to play this game. This sucks because not only did PT look like an amazing game based off of just the teaser, but it also also could have served as a revival of the Silent Hill series, kinda like the treatment that Resident Evil has been getting in the last couple of years with games like Biohazard and Village, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The scariest thing about PT isn't even something the average player will notice. Apparently, like, the ghost woman is locked onto you and follows you at all times. That's pretty much all I have to say. Now I just gotta find a way to segue onto the next part. Around this time, we begin to see a rise in the popularity of indie horror with games like Outlast, Layers of Fear, and Slender. These games are made by smaller studios, and sometimes just one person. Indie games are usually shorter than a AAA game and had less impressive graphics, but were able to pack in more substance, excluding Slender. And some indie developers realized that they could actually use the older graphics to their advantage, to create a scarier, more unsettling environment, recreating the nostalgic feeling of playing a Nintendo 64 or PS2 game. One of the most notable games to emerge out of 2010 indie horror was Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's was developed by just one man, with that man being Scott Cawthon. And I'm sure everyone knows the backstory behind this game, so I'm just not going to repeat it. From this point, I'm just going to call it FNAF because Five Nights at Freddy's is way too long. The gameplay of FNAF involved using security cameras to monitor haunted animatronics and stop them from getting into your office. The game was praised for its atmosphere and character design. FNAF was popularized by content creators on YouTube as everyone wanted to see their reaction to the game's infamous jump scares. This is the second scariest thing I've seen Markiplier do. This wasn't new, as games like Slender and Amnesia were able to grow after being played by large content creators, but the level of success FNAF was able to reach was unprecedented. The game helped many content creators to grow their channels and build a fan base. FNAF would become an indie horror juggernaut with 9 games, 84 game theories, and a movie on the way. Wait, 84? FNAF began the genre of mascot horror, taking characters that would be used to entertain children and turning them into something sinister and grotesque. But then something happened that nobody could have predicted. The characters that were made to entertain kids entertained kids. In the future, this would lead to a bunch of games devoid of passion that would try to capitalize on the genre's success. But it wasn't all bad, as indie horror would produce some amazing games like Soma, Amori, and Irelung. But then, once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm gonna end off this section by saying, even if you hate FNAF, you have to admit that it has done a lot of good for indie horror. Or maybe not, I don't know. The Resident Evil series would have another sort of revival in 2017 when Capcom released Resident Evil Biohazard. Biohazard moved away from the action of Resident Evil 5 and 6 and chose to go first person, focus on exploration, and even introduce a new protagonist. A year prior to its announcement at E3 in 2016, it was presented as a VR demo called Kitchen. Resident Evil Biohazard was well received when it was released, selling 11 million copies worldwide, and even being nominated for some end-of-year accolades. Biohazard's gameplay emphasized horror and exploration. The game even has stealth elements that allow you to avoid bosses. One of the things that helped Biohazard to stand out as a Resident Evil game was the protagonist. Unlike Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, or Leon Kennedy, Ethan Winters is just a regular guy looking for his wife. Now, Ethan's character has faced some criticism as some fans believe that he's sort of bland and a little bit too boring, or just a little plain, but I think this is actually by design. This decision leaves room for the player to sort of insert themselves into the game and, you know, add another layer of immersion maybe. Some people believe that the game was inspired by PT, but Biohazard beat the PT allegations as it was actually in development before the release of PT. Instead, Resident Evil Biohazard took inspiration from a different game, Sweet Home. Now, if you remember from earlier on in the video, Sweet Home actually inspired the first
Resident Evil
in 1996. Yep, tying everything back together, and you guys say I don't make good videos. Hey, come on. Biohazard was well received by fans of the Resident Evil series, as many welcomed the more grounded horror approach. In 2021, Capcom released Resident Evil Village, a sequel to Biohazard. Village kept the first-person camera angle, but added a heavier emphasis on combat. This divided the fan base, as the series seemed like it was moving away from combat and more towards pure horror, but overall the game was pretty well received. The game was praised for its variety in gameplay and interesting atmosphere. Village was a commercial success, selling 7.4 million copies in only 4 months. This is due to the hype surrounding a sequel to Biohazard and other things. The game would go on to win Game of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards. And I guess that takes us to modern day. Right now we're in kind of like a drought. The trend of making horror games for kids is almost like an infinite money glitch, but there has been some positive with Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space both getting remixed this year. I'm still very optimistic for the future, and hey, you never know what could happen. So what's the takeaway from this video? What am I trying to say? Horror game soundtracks go unbelievably stupid. I know that this video is very long and took a while to come out, so if you watched it all the way through, I appreciate that. I appreciate all the likes and positive comments and feedback, and the criticism. I've actually learned a lot from, you guys just commenting on my videos. I'm new to this YouTube stuff, so it's all very helpful for me. I do have a Twitter now, so if you want to suggest a video or anything, that's where to do it. But with that being said, I think it's time for me to end this video, so, yeah, bye. Thanks, Evan.